Welcome to today's Cybersecurity Insiders webinar, How to Assess and Close the Cybersecurity Skills Gap for Your Workforce. Today's webinar is brought to you by Raytheon Professional Services, delivering customized end-to-end learning solutions that transform workforce performance. My name is Holger Schulze. I am the founder of Cybersecurity Insiders, the online community for cybersecurity professionals, and I'll be your moderator today. Now it is my pleasure to welcome our featured presenters. First, I'd like to welcome Stuart Adamura. Stuart is Commercial Cyber Training Lead at Raytheon. Welcome, Stuart.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to welcome Dr. David Toby, and David is Director of Research and Assessments at the National Cyber Watch Center. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you both for presenting today.
We're talking today about assessing and closing your cybersecurity skills gap. What we're really talking about is cybersecurity risk. And 1 out of every 3 companies has been impacted by cyber attacks, and that number is just expected to grow. A recent study I saw just said that data breaches and ransomware attacks are going to rise by 175% over the next 5 years. Attackers are targeting companies looking for vulnerabilities that they can exploit, and those vulnerabilities are the risk that we want to understand so we can address them. Risk can exist in your people. It can exist in your processes. It can exist in your technology, standard categories. And let's look at how we would understand and assess the risk in these categories. For your technology, for your systems, there's a cybersecurity risk assessment. What you would do here is you would identify all of your technology and data assets that could be affected by an attack. You would identify the risks that could affect those assets. And then you'd want to assess and evaluate for vulnerabilities in that area. Pretty standard process that companies are quite aware of. If you wanted to understand the risk in your processes, you would conduct a cybersecurity audit. Here you would assess your company's policies, your processes, your security controls. You'd look at them and see how effective they were and how followed they were. And these 2 processes are well understood, and it's the way the industry is largely focused on ways to address cyber risk. But risk can also exist in your people, and that shows up in the form of skill gaps. And to date, there's not been much focus on assessing workforce risk, nor have there been many tools to do so. That means that this source of potentially significant source of risk goes unassessed and unknown. So that's what we want to talk about today is the workforce, your people. So we're going to go ahead and look at the workforce in a little more detail. This is a pyramid that just shows that there are different levels of your workforce representing smaller populations as you move up the pyramid. At the bottom is your general workforce, everybody in your company who has access to your infrastructure and thus could be a target for attackers. As your technology protections get more robust, the attackers have shifted towards targeting your workforce, usually through phishing. In fact, phishing now represents the biggest cyber threat for companies. Corresponding to this risk, we have seen in the past year an increasing focus on cybersecurity awareness training. And that's a real good thing because that's the gap that we want to start looking at. There has been improvement, but there's still a big gap. In fact, a recent study I saw showed that 70% of employees still don't have an understanding of cybersecurity. That means the focus for security, the burden, if you will, falls on your professional workforce, your IT and your cybersecurity workforce. Let's look at this middle population, your IT workforce. They're an important element of your security and a potential source of risk. They maintain your infrastructure. They fix vulnerabilities that have been identified. They're often in a position to identify breaches as they happen. However, there is often little cyber training beyond basic awareness, security awareness training for this population. This lack of focus leads to a disconnect between the IT workforce and the cyber workforce, and recent studies have shown this disconnect creates a real disconnect with critical security issues. In fact, it's just one thing that we see. Studies continue to show that basic security measures such as patching continue to be a major problem, and it doesn't seem to be improving year over year. So if you wanted to assess this middle population for their cybersecurity capabilities, how would you do so? That's something we want to think about today. At the top of the pyramid, the smallest part of your population is the dedicated cybersecurity workforce. Any capabilities any capability gaps in this population represent risks that attacker can exploit. So how do you know what the capability of this workforce is? Usually we assume capability based upon certifications or background or experience or education. The problem is that certifications tell you what someone knows. They don't always tell you what someone can do. And similarly, they tell you that someone has met a standard or met a bar, but they don't tell you what the strengths and weaknesses are for that individual, or correspondingly for the entire population of your cybersecurity workforce. You don't know what the capabilities are, and you don't know what you might need to look at as a potential risk. So if you wanted to get a picture of the capabilities of this workforce, how could you go about assessing it? The answer to that question really starts to reveal that there might be some risks. So I want to talk about some of the common risks that we see in the workforce. So workforce risk falls into three categories. First of all, risk might show up as individual gaps. For example, failure to cover cyber basics. Most attacks exploit a short established list of vulnerabilities. In fact, last year, the top 10 vulnerabilities accounted for over 78% of all vulnerabilities. Timely patching could have blocked most of those vulnerabilities. Is your IT staff aware of the importance of these basics? Are they prioritizing patching accordingly? How do you know? Mismatched skill set, another gap that presents risk. The individual strengths and weaknesses of your professionals might not be the best matches for the needs of your organization. There might be skill gaps that are critical, but which are unknown. If you don't have a level of visibility into the capabilities, those gaps remain unknown, at least until a breach exposes them. The second category of risk is team gaps. For example, skills concentrated in a few key individuals. This is something we find pretty consistent in our cyber workforces. Those key individuals become critical to the organization in terms of responding to issues, but also in terms of coaching and mentoring new team members. You can find that their time gets pulled in multiple directions, and that makes them a little bit less effective. And additionally, if you're relying on just a few key individuals to onboard and mentor others, what you end up with is a homogeneous set of capabilities and a corresponding homogeneous set of gaps. You're also vulnerable to a steep drop in capability if one of those key individuals moves to another role, and we know that turnover is pretty rife in our industry. Another capability that's often lacking on teams is offensive cyber skill. Standard cyber training is focused on defense. Many cyber professionals don't have a real background in offensive cyber. If your team as a whole has limited offensive skills, that means they're less capable of anticipating and identifying new attack vectors. Again, something that we see pretty consistent in organizations. The third and final level of workforce risk shows up as enterprise level gaps. For example, risks are constantly evolving. Your team's skills need to evolve as well. Without a strategic approach to ongoing training on the latest threats and methods, your enterprise cyber capability can lag over time. Gaps and vulnerabilities can develop with little or no visibility to you. Finally, this issue of confusing compliance with cybersecurity. This was listed on a recent survey as the most critical corporate cyber risk. I think it's really core to understanding why there are gaps in enterprise capability. If you don't have an intentional focus on understanding your workforce capability, what you begin to do is make assumptions. The assumption is that if I've complied with regulations, if I've complied with my company's policies, if I've met my goals and objectives, that automatically translates to security. That assumption just simply isn't true. And what it leads to is invisible, unknown, but very real cyber risk. Of course, this wouldn't be a cyber presentation if we didn't talk about some statistics. So here's a few statistics about risk. A survey that was conducted earlier this year by Cybersecurity Insiders, sponsored by Raytheon Professional Services, showed that 45% of organizations were worried that they lacked the skills required to navigate today's cybersecurity landscape. That's a pretty significant number. David, does that result match what you've seen from your perspective?
Yeah, sure does. And we'll talk more about that when I dive into the assessments. Excellent,
great. This second number, just another look at the same problem. 59% on the most recent ISC squared survey said that they're extreme or moderate risk due to a shortage of cyber staff. These numbers are dramatic, and it means to me, it means it's absolutely critical that companies have visibility on what their risk really is. Just to take these numbers and put them in context, what I'd love to do, Holger, is kind of see what the audience thinks. Can you run the audience poll in this area?
Absolutely, thank you, Stuart. And the next audience poll question is, how confident are you, that your organization has the skills to navigate today's cyber landscape? And here are the results. The winner clearly with 59% is somewhat confident, somewhere in the middle, followed by not very confident at 18%, followed by highly confident, 11%, and then not at all confident, 7%, not sure, 5%. Stuart, David, any surprises in here?
Well, it's interesting. This is something we find often, which again, I'll highlight further as to why and as we get into the details of the assessments, but often there's a false sense of confidence because the information we have available to us, as you've kind of noted, Stuart, is unfortunately giving, an impression that's pretty remote or pretty abstract from the actual threats. And consequently, we don't know that we should be less confident in our organization's capability until those capabilities have been exposed or exploited. And that's something we need to understand better by drilling down into the details. As they say, the devil's in the details. So, finding that devil isn't going to be easy. And oftentimes the assessments we're using are obscuring the details that we need to know.
Yeah, I'm heartened by the large people who are somewhat confident. I'm hopeful that as you said, that confidence is accurate. But let's talk through what thinking about risk and how we make it visible. Ideally, you'd want to know the capabilities of your workforce, the strengths and the weaknesses in various areas of cybersecurity. I'm just using a simple example here. I've taken the NIST cybersecurity framework and the 5 cyber functions as an example. Most organizations don't know what their workforce's capabilities are in those 5 cyber functions. They literally, they don't know what they don't know. They think they have capability, but what they don't know could represent a risk. Not necessarily, but could represent a risk. But what if you could know? What if you could look at, again, just using this example, these 5 functions, what if you could see your workforce's capability on an individual level or on a workforce basis? In the example here, it would be very valuable to know that your organization is strong in protect and recover, but has a gap in detect. In fact, this gap in detect is something that we see pretty consistently, and the data backs it up. So just last week, the Verizon data breach report for 2019 was released, and it was interesting to me. It showed that 56% of breaches take months before they're discovered. They take months before they're detected. So that, to me, represents a pretty interesting data point. If a company's workforce was weak at detecting when a breach has occurred, that company would be at risk, or worse, that company could already be compromised and just hasn't discovered it yet. If you had visibility, like the picture shows here, into what your workforce strengths and weaknesses were, you'd be much better positioned to manage your workforce risk. And an assessment, an effective assessment, is a way to deliver that visibility. In fact, a robust assessment can deliver much more information than this simple little example I've showed. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to David, and he's going to talk a little more about assessments in detail.
Thank you, Stuart. So let's start first by understanding the different types of assessments. Unfortunately, many assessments that companies use today are actually creating the types of risks that Stuart had referenced at the individual, team, and enterprise level. And it's simply because we focus too much on descriptive assessments or assessments that are looking at just a snapshot of the current state. These types of assessments tend to focus on indications of achievements, such as certifications, or measuring the knowledge that someone might have gained, perhaps the courses that they may have attended, or in some cases, other tests that they may have taken. Most importantly, these types of assessments tend to be very focused at the individual level, and the way they're designed don't allow us to easily aggregate their information from individual to looking at the team in a more holistic way, certainly to looking at the enterprise and addressing some of the major gaps that Stuart's already pointed out in some of these previous slides. The result of which is many of these checkboxes, which is really what these many assessments are that organizations have used, are designed, as Stuart mentioned, to really indicate compliance, that we've covered the bases, that we've checked the boxes. But in order to truly understand risk, we need to delve deeper. We need to not just simply be descriptive. We need to start to understand what the future might bring and what our preparation is for that future. What is our capability or the potential of our capability to manage the event that we haven't seen yet? In order to do that, we have to get a picture of the future state. And this means moving beyond simply past achievements to look at the potential profile of our organization. We can't simply look at an individual, but rather have to aggregate across individuals. And consequently, measuring is more than just simply measuring knowledge. We have to move beyond simply the knowing of what to do to ensure that we'll be capable of performing when the difficulties arise. And what we have found in study after study and work that's been done with the U.S. military over many years and along with many other organizations that are on the crisis response line is that oftentimes having common skill sets, as Stuart mentioned, oftentimes where people will bring in other individuals like them when they're looking, or will mentor individuals to be like them. Unfortunately, what we have found in study after study is that if people share a common skill set, if they don't have complementary capabilities, they can have common blind spots. And so simply being skilled is not good enough if what it does is leave you open to a vulnerability as a result of having a common set of skills without complementary skills. So we need to understand where our weakest links are. And consequently, we need to move from a description focus to really an analytical focus. How can we understand what are the workforce gaps that might be targeted by an attacker? And in order to do that, we also need to be able to take specific actions that could improve our current state, but also enable us to prevent or better respond to that future attack that we can't anticipate yet today. Consequently, what predictive assessments ultimately allow us to do is to really drill down at a very detailed level from the current state of achievement into predicting our ability to respond to a known or unknown event. So what do these look like? A typical assessment that's predictive will not simply give you a pass-fail, a certificate or no certificate, but instead will allow you to determine capability across the spectrum of responsibilities that must be performed well in order for cybersecurity to be effective. And so what we have here is a list of 14 areas that were identified by a large group of international experts a number of years ago in a study that we conducted, which enabled us to gain an appreciation for not only what are the roles that need to be filled, but more importantly, how do capabilities differ across these roles in organizations? Again, at the individual, at the team, and overall at the enterprise level. So Stuart referenced before the results from a 2019 study that showed that nearly a quarter of all the security incidents are resulting from unpatched software. This chart begins to explain why. This is real data from a real organization and a real individual at this level. And what it's showing here is that a number of our individuals working in cyber domains or working in the IT workforce have strength in compliance-related activities. They're able to communicate results of security activities and certainly security incidents. They're able to manage processes and projects that are associated with those cybersecurity programs, and they have competence in performing these communication and process management capabilities. But they only have proficiency. They only understand. They're sort of merely proficient in logging incidents that occur, and more importantly, responding to attacks when they happen. But even here, while we have understanding, what we really are lacking is the competence to perform. And much of that is coming from the fact that we've focused on firefighting as opposed to fire prevention. So imagine, if I would like you to think about it, if your town or city that you live in, if your firefighting team, your firefighter specialists would be able to do their job if thousands of fires were started each and every day. That's really what's happening today in cybersecurity. Ransomware attacks are up 350% annually. IoT attacks are up 600% annually. And studies that we've been conducting, our evidence is showing that companies today have unfortunately been focusing on the understanding of cybersecurity and the awareness of cybersecurity, as Stuart mentioned earlier, but less focus has been given to, are we effectively performing the tasks and the mission of cybersecurity? In other words, moving beyond credentials to really focus on capability. So what I'd like you to think about is, how often do your IT teams practice preventing, diagnosing, and defending against the dozens of cybersecurity threats that exist today? Do they have a simulator? Do they have a practice range that daily, weekly, monthly, they're practicing against the latest or even the most common known effects on a regular basis? Imagine, if you will, flying in an airplane with a pilot who had never been in a simulator, had never experienced and had practice in dealing with the wind shear that could cause a sudden loss of altitude, or addressing a fairly less common de-icing that occurs in the winter months that could cause a failure eliminating the thrust on takeoff, which caused a crash of an Air Florida jet many years ago in Washington, D.C. Or imagine an engine failure mid-flight, let alone probably the most famous type of response that came from working hours and hours and hours in the simulator, is being able to ditch a plane on a river, as Captain Sully did in the Hudson, and obviously made a movie out of it. So in order to truly understand our capability, we need to not only assessments be predictive, but we have to ensure that it's valid, that it's actually giving us information on how we can perform, to what extent we can perform, and who, most importantly, needs improvements in their capabilities. Much of the assessments today, which are typically called summative assessments because they're aggregating what we've known in the past or what we could do in the past, they don't tend to tell us where the gaps are. They don't tend to tell us how do we directly address those gaps. So we've been working on inventing a new science of validation, and that science is the science of potential performance. The idea here is to know not simply when does somebody know the right answer, but more specifically when they don't understand the wrong answer. When is the wrong thing? What is the wrong thing to do in a particular situation? Or how might the action they're about to take create more risk rather than reducing risk? So understanding failure is the key also to raising capability maturity. And what we're finding in study after study, it is the key indicator. We can learn a lot about understanding what people know or even what they can do, but we learn even more and actually have a bigger impact on overall capability maturity and raise the security of the organization by understanding what we don't know or what we can't yet perform, because it's those things that become targets for the most effective attacks. So what these assessments are really designed to do is to give you a picture, but not a snapshot like you saw with a number of different prior credentialing programs, but rather a snapshot of your future, a snapshot of where your capability needs to improve. They help you answer questions such as, do you know what skill gaps exist in the people you've entrusted with in taking care of your infrastructure and your systems? But that doesn't just simply include people in your workforce. Many organizations today rely on outside services. Do you know what the capabilities are of your contractors? Do you know what supplier gaps might exist in the form of capabilities that are lacking? That, again, our experiences over the last several years have shown to be primary causes of major cyber attacks were occurring because of a supplier failure as opposed to the organization failure. Even your audits, how do you know what the capabilities are of your auditors? Do you know if and when training courses that you're using are going to have an effect on raising that capability? Or more specifically, which training courses have the biggest return on investment in terms of raising capability overall? So here's a look at what this might look at as an organizational level. The next image I'd like to show you is, again, real data, comes from a real organization, large organization with thousands and thousands of employees. And what they found across the board is the organization resembled the individuals. They all shared some of the similar strengths in the area of communicating results, managing projects and budgets, but where the biggest gap was in understanding how their systems could be exploited. If we don't know how a system could ultimately be attacked, the methods that could be used, the tools that would be implemented, the indicators that would create, then, as Stuart mentioned earlier, it's not surprising that Verizon and others are finding that many of these attacks remain unseen, unaware for months on end, because the organization doesn't have capability in attacking systems. We focus so much on defense, not that defense is not important. Clearly, we need to be focused on continually improving our prevention and our defensive systems. But if we don't know, or if our people aren't capable of attacking a system, then they likely won't see an attack, especially a sophisticated attack, because they won't be familiar with how that might come about or how it might influence a particular system. So what would these reports give you in terms of visibility? There are a number of detailed and actionable reports that result from a predictive potential performance assessment. And I'll walk you briefly through each one of these, and of course, I'm available to answer questions at the end of the webinar about any one of these specific areas. So you've all probably used resumes and credentials to manage your workforce programs in the past. What this gives you is now a much more detailed look. Rather than knowing how many years someone spent on the job, or perhaps what major accomplishments they had in position A or position B, or even internal to the organization, what their performance ratings have been. This allows us to get a comparative analysis. How is this person performing against expectations? How is this person performing against their peers? And this particular one is a pretty capable person. This is probably typical of what you would find at that often called tip of the spear, the top of the pyramid that Stuart talked about, where you have a cyber specialist who is meeting or exceeding job capability expectations in 44 out of the 47 areas that are covered by this particular assessment. And that they're on average better than most in performing, or at least on par with the average of others in their peer group. This person would be a great firefighter. However, it's also important to note that sending that person to training that reinforces what they already have capability for probably would waste their time and probably wouldn't be a good investment on your behalf. And therefore, we want to focus really on those three areas in the gray on the left chart, and the one area in the right that, in comparison to their peers, is indicating a trouble spot, an area in which this individual, unless they raise their capability maturity in that domain, could create a vulnerability and a weak link in the system that could be exploited. How do we know what those are? Well, the assessment then gives us a detailed analysis at the job role level. So here's an example for a security engineer. The responsibilities listed there are, again, come from an international study involving thousands of subject matter experts and organizations from a broad cross-section of industries, as well as government, academia, et cetera. And this allows you to get a normative analysis, meaning similar to a standardized assessment such as a graduate admissions exam or a college entrance exam, or the ASVAB that's used by the U.S. military. It allows me on a scale of 1 to 100, get an idea of what is this individual's capability. But it also then allows me to understand how does that capability compare to a maturity level expectation, and how does it compare against their peers. So the workforce maturity assessment has 5 levels, which were noted on that prior diagram. But in case you missed them, 0 is a novice, 1 is a beginner, 2 is a proficient, level 3 is someone who's competent, and level 4 is an expert. So let's look specifically drill down here at the exploit penetration targets that we saw on that prior slide. Was a weakness not only for an individual, but across the group as a whole. Notice here that this particular individual is clearly a novice in this area. Score of a 24.44, but notice it's average for their peers. So not only does this represent a threat, a concern for that individual, but perhaps organizationally is even a greater threat because on average, their peers in the organization or their peers in the operational role that they're in tend also to lack their capacity to exploit penetration targets. They therefore would be vulnerable to the use of specific techniques or tools or procedures and processes that they're unaware of because they have not had experience in practice in exploiting systems. The other thing this reveals is perhaps they haven't practiced enough. So the next level of breakdown gives us a feel for how might they compare against national frameworks. Stuart had mentioned earlier and used as the example the NIST security framework of protect, defend, etc. There's also the National Cybersecurity Workforce Framework that was developed by NIST along with the Department of Homeland Security and an organization called the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, NICE. So that's what you see here on the left. These are the competencies that came from that NICE framework. And it allows us to begin to connect the dots between what someone's capable of doing today, but more specifically, what education and training are going to be helpful in developing their capabilities for tomorrow. We can also use these same type of analyses to compare against industry frameworks, such as, for instance, the electric subsector's cybersecurity capability maturity model, the ESC2M2 for those who might be in the utility sector, that was developed by the Department of Energy. Other industries are developing their own, the financial services or retail, etc. And so each of these benchmarks can be done on multiple levels. There can also be organizational specific benchmarks that you might have for your particular expectations of each and every individual. Once you understand what the profile of that individual is, then you can start to create a predictive analysis of what they should do next. And so what we see here is a report for the security engineer. Again, remember, this particular individual was highly capable, at least in the area of proficiency. So they knew what to do, but they would need much more practice. And so one of the recommendations undoubtedly would be to spend time in real-time labs and other forms of cyber practice range. But there were still those gaps where they didn't know what to do. And so in this particular learning path recommendation, you see here that the first and foremost thing they should do is understand the protection of information assets, the Part 2 specific course module from, in this particular instance, Skillsoft. There are thousands of these courses that are built into the system to give you a very specific set of recommendations in sequential order in order to know which course is the next best assignment for that individual in order to have the biggest impact on raising their overall capability maturity and addressing perhaps a workforce gap where that skill set is also missing across the enterprise, and therefore you have a special vulnerability. So it takes into account in developing these recommendations for each and every individual, what is that individual's capability profile, but also what is the capability profile of the team, the capability profile of the enterprise, and if an organization wishes, this could be mapped to your enterprise resource planning systems to determine how that relates to your enterprise-wide expectations and development plans. So with that,
Great.
I'll turn it over to Stuart to tell you a little bit more about where we go from here.
Thank you very much, David. I appreciate that. Once you've got a picture, you've run an assessment, you've got a picture of your capabilities, your strengths and weaknesses, what do you do? So we've got 5 steps here as to you take that and you do something with it to reduce those gaps. So first of all, you want to contextualize those gaps. You want to map them to the risks and the threats that you are aware of against your organization. If you're using a framework like NIST or ISO, you want to map those gaps against that framework. That gives you context to understand those gaps. Then you can prioritize the second step against your greatest risk. You can begin to understand what you need to address first, what might need to be addressed immediately, what might need to be addressed over time. You've got some more time to work with. You'll notice these first two steps are things that come explicitly out of the assessment that David showed you. The assessment contextualizes and prioritizes your risks coming right out of it. If you've done the setup correctly, that should be coming out of the predictive assessment. The third step is target. So now you want to begin to think about the intervention you're going to use to reduce those critical gaps. Do you need to reduce it across the workforce? It's a workforce gap. Are there individual gaps you really need to target? You've got some options here you need to begin to think about. And then how do you reduce that gap? Training is an option, certainly. Different ways to train, but talent might be a different way of doing it. You might want to adjust your hiring targets. You might want to actually look at bringing in somebody in specifically. So how are you going to do it? You're going to consider that. And then once you've planned that, you want to tailor your interventions for efficiency. Make sure your training program is training to the gaps. Develop customized learning plans so that individuals have requirements for what they need to learn, as well as optional things they can learn as well. But all this allows you to make your training solution as efficient as possible. And then finally, you want to make sure your plan is dynamic. You need to be ready to adjust as new threats are identified. This is something you need to have a cadence on, that you review and revisit regularly to make sure that you are continuing to maintain that level of protection for your organization. So let me put it all together in one big picture for you. So how would you, the webinar is, how would you assess and close the cybersecurity skills gap for your workforce? You want to begin with an assessment. That is the starting place. Unless you understand the gaps, you will struggle to be efficient and effective in closing them. So begin with an assessment. As we've discussed, you get the most complete picture when you can look at it as an individual, as a team, and as an enterprise or as a workforce. You want to make sure you have assessments that can give you that big picture. This is like I say, the right way to start. If you don't have a workforce structure set up yet, you may want to conduct a job analysis to identify the roles and capabilities you need prior to conducting an assessment. Once you've done this step, then you can look at training strategies that will help close that gaps. Those training strategies could include professional training to address specific skills. It could include role-based training on critical roles that you have to really beef up. It could be training on your specific security stack. You want to consider a mix of custom training as well as commercial off-the-shelf training to be as efficient as possible in closing those gaps. Certifications can certainly be a part of the solution, but you want to map those certifications against the assessment results so that you're not paying for certifications you don't need. We all know that certifications can be fairly expensive. You want to develop customized learning journeys so each individual is taking the training that they need in the order that they need. You want to be sure to include both required and optional training, because sometimes individuals want to take some additional training. You want to make sure that additional training is still closing gaps. Another strategy you should be considering is talent management. So can you close gaps through talent management strategies? You can adjust your recruiting targets to fill specific gaps. If you've got hard to find talent, which we can see in the industry, staff augmentation might make sense. Or if you've got a real big gap, then you might even consider outsourcing. The assessment, though, might reveal insights into your employees that you can leverage. Your employees might have strengths that allow you to develop them for a new role. A side benefit of customized development plans like this is that they increase staff engagement and they reduce the likelihood of turnover. And if you're doing a better job at developing your internal talent, you now can look at less expensive ways of adding talent, such as employing hire and develop strategies or apprenticeships. The visibility you get from an assessment gives you a whole lot of options in terms of the most efficient way to build your cyber workforce capabilities. It's important to note that these efforts are not one-time activities. The best results are achieved when you set a regular, intentional cadence of assessment and strategy review. By employing these approaches in an integrated, holistic, and strategic fashion, you can reduce your cyber risk rapidly, effectively, and in a much more cost-efficient manner. If you need a partner to assist with your efforts, all of the items that we've shown here in this diagram are part of Raytheon Professional Services cybersecurity offerings. We have the complete end-to-end range of services to assess and close the cyber gaps for your workforce. Raytheon protects the networks of governments and commercial companies on a global scale, and Raytheon Professional Services brings that expertise to workforce assessment and cyber training. So that's the end of a formal presentation. Holger, I'm going to hand it back to you at this point so you can address some questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Stuart. When you provide the results of an assessment, are people surprised, or does it just reinforce what they were expecting?
Yeah, sure. So Holger, I will tell you that the results for many organizations have been eye-opening in really three areas. First, they discovered strengths they didn't know they had. That there were individuals, oftentimes in the IT workforce, where we find these assessments are most revealing, that there were individuals that had capabilities that the organization was unaware of, and that those capabilities could now begin to be leveraged. They could be used to train or mentor others, and also obviously begin to build a bench for their cybersecurity team. Secondly, it enabled organizations to begin to improve reaction time. A number of years ago, and even today, there are organizations that were heavily impacted by distributed denial of service attacks. And in a number of these organizations that we had assessed, their cybersecurity teams knew exactly what to do. In fact, and even in many cases anticipated an attack occurring and had developed mitigation strategies and other techniques that they were going to use to either prevent or respond. But they weren't responsible for the thousands of individuals that had to implement those techniques and tactics throughout their networks. And when the recommendations and mitigations were handed over to the IT team, the response was, I don't understand what you're talking about. I don't know how to do this. I don't agree with this. And consequently, it took weeks or months in some organizations to respond and effectively address these distributed denial of service impacts, because the IT workforce really wasn't yet capable of understanding, directing, implementing, and mastering the techniques required in order to prevent and to respond. And finally, these assessments can improve resilience. So another organization we worked with, a large utility, found that their best people, their most capable people, were actually the ones who were the most at risk of losing due to retirement.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Now let's see. The next question here is, where would you start with a cyber assessment? With your cyber workforce, with your IT workforce, or both?
Certainly there's benefit to looking across both populations. We found, though, that IT workforce, which is a broader population, is often not considered in terms of cybersecurity. So it's very helpful to run an assessment against that organization. That gives you a lot of information you didn't have previously. A lot of people, when they think about their cybersecurity risk and how confident they are in the organization, they're thinking about that top end of the pyramid. We think there's value, and we've found that there's value in assessing that middle of the pyramid as well. And assessments are a fairly straightforward, easy entry point in terms of a way to do that.
Thank you, Stuart. The next question, do you ever see companies using the assessment to assess their contract workforce, contractors, right, or just employees? Stuart, David?
David, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, sure. In fact, yes, this is probably if you will, the most growing trend. There's a recognition that much of cybersecurity today is dependent on contracted labor, and that the visibility of that contracted labor's capabilities is not there. It's a black hole in many cases, and yet, we've seen the value of these types of assessments to improve quality of lots of other systems. For instance, long before cybersecurity was a primary concern, the issues of software quality were very prevalent. And the capability maturity model, CMM, was originally developed out of Carnegie Mellon University specifically to try to address those. And the federal government saw such value, as an example, in using these techniques to understand the capabilities of their contract workforce, that they mandated it now so that in large or very high demand or high risk software programs, the contractor has to demonstrate that at a level 3 or a level 4 as an organization in order to win federal contracts. We think that we're going to start seeing this more and more across the board in cybersecurity, where organizations are going to be demanding of their contract labor that they demonstrate and be able to validate their capability maturity to ensure that the risk is being mitigated. And finally, we're beginning to see insurance companies wade into this market. And the biggest issue for insurance is you have to be able to identify and quantify the level of risk. There's no greater way or better way to be able to quantify that risk than in terms of determining the capability of suppliers, the capability of contractors, and really the entire ecosystem that organization is involved in.
Thank you, David. All right, let's see. The next question here, this is a good one. If I were to start with an assessment, what IT roles would make sense to start with?
So what we've seen most effective is you want to start with the front lines. Those individuals that are directly involved in system administration, in systems provisioning, in systems architecture design, basically all the fundamental areas of IT. That's where we find the greatest gaps. It's also where we find the greatest potential vulnerability and impact. So I would certainly suggest to you that while it's important to assess, broadly, the first place usually you want to begin is ensuring the fundamentals are covered. And surprisingly, as I mentioned earlier, the assessments have been really eye-opening for a number of organizations. And perhaps the area in which they've been most eye-opening is the exposure of the fact that a lot of the fundamentals aren't really fully mastered. And people are aware of the fundamental things to do, perhaps. They've been in a training class, they've heard about it, but they haven't executed enough, they haven't practiced it enough, or they didn't fully master understanding of it. And consequently, they're leaving fundamental systems vulnerable as a result of not understanding the basics. So I would start really with the frontline staff.
The next question, how did you come up with the skill sets used in the assessment?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, those came from an international group, the National Board of Information Security Examiners, where I happen to be the role as the chief scientist of that and designing these instruments. And we involved groups from all over the world. It was an effort that was sponsored by the National Security Agency, by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, by the Department of Energy, and by obviously areas within the U.S. military, as well as a number of international organizations. So it is very broad-based in terms of its coverage across multiple industries, but also very deep in terms of the expertise areas that were tapped. And again, generally speaking, it was about, if I remember the number right, it was around 750 different subject matter experts from across the varying domains in cyber.
Can you give an example of a significant vulnerability you've seen within an IT workforce?
Yeah, I think, again, David, the areas I mentioned earlier are very, very common. And, again, not being aware of how a network configuration it can either lead to or exacerbate the impact of an attack. We've repeatedly seen that a number of, like I said, the basics are just not covered well. And consequently, in a sense, we're leaving the doors and windows open every day. And not surprisingly, our cybersecurity teams are pretty well taxed. I mean, it isn't news to say that many organizations are realizing the difficulty in either finding or keeping cybersecurity staff. And much of that we're finding with these assessments are due to the fact that they're simply overworked, overloaded, and in a sense, over-needed because the capability and maturity of that IT workforce isn't there. So there have been a number of instances, as I mentioned earlier, where suppliers have failed to adequately address the cybersecurity of their systems, and consequently, in fact, very commonly, attackers are utilizing the network of networks to connect and to get access, and then to embed themselves in ways that can lead to advanced persistent threats. And then finally, one of the areas that we see being quite notable is as Stuart mentioned earlier, things like, common things, phishing, right? Is 91% of all attacks started with a phishing exercise. And most people think, well, phishing is something that happens to my end user, right? And certainly it does. But there was a study that recently was done that found that, nearly 80% of IT workers are constantly being barraged with phishing attempts, and many of them have been exposed as being vulnerable to them. So phishing isn't simply a problem for, the front desk person. It's a problem that is occurring in our IT workforce, who have much greater access, much more elevated rights in working on systems than some of the end users do. Well, most of the end users do.
Yeah, I'll just reinforce that. Yeah, I saw a study yesterday that showed that I believe it was 55% of, on average, of organizational systems are not patched in organizations. That's just a huge number. So as you mentioned, the basics are often not covered because we're prioritizing availability over security. So I think, again, that middle part of the population, if they don't understand the priority of security issues like just patching, that becomes a significant issue. And of course, there's a shadow network as well in terms of, do they even know all of the systems and the software out there? So I think that just some of the basics become a real issue and a real opportunity for for reducing risk on a pretty straightforward basis if you understand what the capabilities are of your population.
Excellent. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, David. I appreciate your insights and answers to these questions. And with that, we're at the finish line for today's session. As we're closing this webinar, I would like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. I would also like to thank you, Stuart and David, for sharing your insights on how to assess and close the cybersecurity workforce skills gap. Thank you.
Thank you, Holger.
Thank you,
Now,
Holger.
this concludes today's session. I hope we will see all of you again at one of our future webinars. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.